Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an art professor and a professional artist. And in this video, we're going to cover how to draw clothing in pen and ink. This, I think, is one of the more challenging things artists are required to do, in any medium really, and I'm going to give you effective strategies for doing long rendered drawings of clothing as well as quick sketches, and along the way show you examples by the great German painter and printmaker Albrecht Durer to see if we can learn something from the way he tackled this very daunting subject. Let's begin with what I think is the most important principle of drawing. In order to draw something well, you have to understand it. In order to draw a cube correctly, you have to understand the rules of linear perspective. In order to draw the figure correctly, you have to understand human anatomy. And to draw clothing correctly, you have to understand the rules that govern the appearance of folds. So let's quickly go over the anatomy of folds, the different kinds of folds you see in clothing, how they're formed, and how they tend to behave. While there is no consensus on the number of different fold types, with some sources distinguishing as many as 9 different kinds of folds, I'm going to reduce them to 5, with some folds being variations rather than their own distinct fold type. First, it's important to understand that folds originate from points of tension and/or compression, and that each kind of fold arises from variations in the number and placement of those points. In the first fold type is the simple pipe fold, where gravity creates a single point of tension from which the folds fall. Pipe folds are often visible on seated figures wearing long robes, where knees create a single point of tension, resulting in long pipe folds originating from the kneecap. Here's a drawing with an example of such folds. A variation on the pipe fold is the drop fold, which is simply a pipe fold with multiple points of tension due to the combined forces of compression and gravity. Such folds are visible in drapes or towels hanging on a line, but are also seen in dresses that are cinched at the waist, such as in this drawing. Really, what you're seeing in the drop fold is a series of individual pipe folds squished together. The second fold type is called the diaper fold. In this case, there are 2 points of tension which create crescent-shaped folds running from one point to the other. One often encounters this type of fold in clothing on seated figures where folds run from one knee to the other, such as in this drawing. The third fold type is called the spiral fold, often seen in tubes of cloth such as sleeves and pant legs. Such folds are created by cloth compressing around cylindrical forms such as arms, legs, and torsos. Depending on the stiffness of the cloth, these folds can be crescent-shaped or angular, creating a variation on the spiral curve called the zigzag fold. Here's an example of this fold type. The fourth fold type doesn't seem to have a consistent name for it, but I'm going to call it the bend fold. In this fold type, the folds are created by a point of compression made by the bending of joints such as knees and elbows. These are obviously very common in clothing, and here is a fantastic example of such folds. And lastly, we have the inert fold, which is when cloth is no longer supported by external tension or compression. Such folds are often very complex, with a lot of crumpling and layering of folds, and are highly dependent on the thickness and stiffness of the cloth. One often encounters such folds on very long robes that crumple at the feet. Here's an excellent example of pipe folds transitioning into inert folds in this drawing. While an understanding of these 5 fold types and their underlying architecture is essential to the effective drawing of clothing, the task is made much more complicated by the fact that a number of different fold types can occur in a single area. For example, diaper folds can transition to spiral folds, bend folds can turn into pipe folds, and as we have just seen in the previous example, pipe folds can turn into inert folds. Furthermore, clothing can be composed of varying materials and have a complex inner structure, which creates internal points of tension and compression. So, beyond understanding the mechanics of folds, having a few simple guidelines to follow makes this process much easier. Here are what I feel are 5 of the most important rules to follow when drawing clothing. The first rule is that mostly what you're seeing when you're looking at folds are a series of cylindrical and conical shapes. And in order to draw those shapes correctly, you want to avoid being linear. Now, what does that mean when you're drawing in pen and ink, which is a fundamentally linear medium? It means this. If I draw the folds with sharp lines all the way through, so we have a fold here in front, and I represent it using a sharp line. If I have another fold here, going like this, and I use another sharp line, let's simplify this just a little bit here. Essentially every fold I'm seeing, I use a sharp line. So we have a series of folds here, and another fold here, like this. Let's introduce another fold here, and another fold here. Those sharp lines are going to have a flattening effect, making your cloth look like it's two-dimensional as opposed to three-dimensional. Now, how do we avoid being linear? Through hatching, because a sharp line looks sharp, but if I put down a series of lines like so, that's going to have a softening effect. So it can go up and down, or it could be a hatch mark that looks like this. These light, closely placed series of lines look like value as opposed to sharp line. So while it's okay to put in sharper lines for the outlines of the form, for the contours, let's say here, this is a perfectly legitimate way of doing things. When it comes to this fold here, I wouldn't put a sharp line there. What I would do is put down something like this. So what I'm doing is I'm putting down a series of lines which creates the impression that the form is curving here. We have a fold coming out here. As opposed to putting down a sharp line, I'm going to use a series of hatch marks. Again, it could be this, or it could be at a diagonal. But this series of lines is going to create the impression that we're dealing with rounded, gradually curving forms, as opposed to something that ends up looking really flat and cut out. Here too, we have a fold. All right, as much as possible, try to avoid being linear on the inside of your forms. On the outside of the forms, it's okay. On the outside of the form, feel free to do it. But this, from the very beginning, is going to give you a much more three-dimensional effect than if you use sharp lines. That is rule number one. The second rule is this. Since folds originate either from points of tension, like they do here in this pipe fold, or points of compression, you should always try to emphasize where those points are and make them clear in your drawing. This you can do with a couple of different tricks. The first is to darken your line quality near areas where the folds originate. So the line quality here could be a little bit darker. But also when you start rendering, the shading here could be a little bit stronger than it is in other places, again, to emphasize where those folds actually come from. So for example, when I start shading this fold, the areas around where the folds originate are going to be rendered with a little tiny bit more contrast. So right now I'm just building up the shadow values along the folds. And then, again, where the folds originate, the shadows can go a little bit darker. Now, sometimes this rule can go up against other rules, compositional rules. So, for instance, the requirement of identifying an area of focus, which could be somewhere outside the point of tension. My point is that if you do emphasize those areas where the folds originate, it makes the structure of the fold a little bit more solid. It reinforces those areas where cloth is hitting body parts, right? And gives your cloth a little bit more structure and a little bit more sense of organization and stability. So rule number 2 is to emphasize either points of tension or compression by making the rendering, the line quality near those areas, just a little bit stronger than anything else. Again, be subtle about it. You don't have to go overboard and really exaggerate these effects. Just a little bit of a darker value, a little bit of a stronger line quality will help in this respect. Rule number 3 is this. The most important influence on the appearance of folds are the forms underneath. And you want to make sure that when you're drawing your folds that you're always reinforcing those fundamental forms. The problem is sometimes the reference itself will lead you to draw folds in such a way that sabotage those fundamental forms. So if you look at the reference, there are a number of folds running across what is cylindrical shape that are essentially straight. So let me draw the contours here. So we have some folds that are rounded, which is definitely a good thing. Here's another rounded fold. But then we have a fold here that runs perfectly straight like this. We have another fold here that runs perfectly straight this way. Let's take a look. We have a fold here that runs straight like this. And then perhaps a little bit more minor, but there are a few other folds that are kind of straight. This one's an important one right here. Right? It doesn't really show the fact that we're dealing with a cylindrical form. So often in drawing, you have to make shifts to clarify what you're actually seeing, because the reference itself is not perfect. The reference itself is sabotaging the sense of volume. So we have a curvature here, and it's going to be much better if we round off the curve here. If we round off the curve here, that gives us a stronger impression that we're dealing with a cylindrical form. This curve right here, this fold, don't make it straight, make it curve. This fold here, make it curve. And definitely the sleeve here, a curvature is going to give us a much stronger impression that we're dealing with a cylinder as opposed to something that's flat and block-like. And anytime you're seeing a straight fold on a rounded form, don't draw it that way. Emphasize the roundness of the forms by curving them a little bit. Right? Again, this gives you a stronger impression that we're dealing with something that is cylindrical as opposed to blocky. That's rule number 3. Don't always follow your reference. Always analyze, be critical of your reference, and improve on your reference. Something I always tell my students is that our goal as artists is not to be human copying machines, to perfectly copy everything with complete accuracy. Always look at your reference critically and improve on it. Do whatever you can to reinforce, in this case, the three-dimensionality of the forms that you're seeing. Round out your curves whenever you're seeing them on a cylindrical shape. Rule number 4 is that in drawing from observation, repetition almost always looks unnatural. When you're drawing folds, and this could be because the reference looks like this, and you draw a grouping of folds that is in some way repetitive or symmetrical. So all 3 folds in this case are the same shape, they're about the same length, they run off the point of tension at about the same angle. That's going to look fake. It's going to look unnatural. Right? In most cases, when you look at folds, in almost every case, when you look at folds, there's going to be some kind of asymmetry there. So here's the point of tension. One fold might be a little bit wider. The fold in the center, for whatever reason, is going to be a little bit longer, a little bit narrower. And then the other fold might be a little bit shorter, for instance. You're never going to have 3 folds or even 2 folds that are exactly the same shape and run from the point of tension at the same angle. This is a really important rule, particularly when you're drawing folds from imagination. You're creating folds on a figure from your head. Do not repeat your folds. And by the way, this rule applies to lots of different things. When you're drawing clouds, you're never going to see 3 bumps on a cloud that are the same shape. Now, one bump is smaller, one comes out a little bit, another one's a little bit wider, right? When you're drawing leaves, you're not going to see leaves that are the same shape next to each other, right? Make the folds look a little bit more organic, a little bit more random, a little bit more natural by introducing asymmetry. And again, sometimes you're going to get a reference that actually looks like this. You're going to see several folds that actually look very similar to each other. Change them up. Variety will make the drawing more interesting, and also in this case, it's going to make the drawing look more natural. Do not repeat your folds. Rule number 5, if you watched many of my videos, you've probably heard of before, and that's not to outline the contours of your objects with one closed line like this. The reason for this is that when you're looking at cloth, you're dealing with a lot of overlapping shapes. One shape in front of another shape in front of another shape. And if you close off your contours with a single line, it gives the impression that the object, as opposed to being complex and overlapping, is actually flat. So if I have a series of volumes like this, here's one volume, here's another volume, here's another volume. To give a stronger impression that these shapes are separate from each other, that they're overlapping each other, a more effective strategy would be to keep the contour a little bit open, meaning that when this line recedes behind this line, I'm going to leave a little gap here. I'm going to let the line fade out here and here. And that little separation, that little fade, gives a much stronger impression that one object is in front of the other. It's one of the more important principles when drawing complex shapes, not to seal off the contours. So always, when you're drawing complex forms, such as folds, pay close attention to what is overlapping what. The contours are always going to be complex. So you might have, okay, maybe a continuous line here because we have one continuous fold, like this. Then it's coming towards us, and then we have another fold here. But when it comes to drawing this fold, I'm not going to connect my contour like I did right here. I'm going to let that line fade out, like so. And then I'm paying attention to where it's going underneath the next fold and letting the line fade out here. So always, 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 when drawing folds, keep the contours complex and emphasize overlap. What is sitting in front of what? Now, this is a lesson from my Fundamentals of Crosshatching class, but in order to get that faded line, we have to draw it on the move. So as opposed to putting the pen down to the paper, making a line, lifting it up, I'm drawing it on the move. I'm starting to move my pen, and as I move my pen, I make contact with the paper. That's going to give me a line that fades in and fades out. If you're not accustomed drawing these faded lines, practice them on their own. Right? Put down a few lines and get in the habit of fading your lines in and out, as opposed to making these dashed lines, which don't give as strong an impression of overlapping form. And it can be quite complicated because, for instance, here we have a fold that comes out and then fades behind this fold. We have another little fold here, comes out from behind and goes in. So hopefully you can see by comparing these two drawings that this one looks flat and outlined. And part of it is because I didn't draw the folds on the inside, whereas this one has a little bit more depth to it. So rule number 5 is to keep the contours of your complex folds open to emphasize their complex and overlapping nature. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's talk about shading. Since the majority of folds are cylindrical, let's first discuss what hatching strategies we can use to render a simple cylinder. The first hatch angle, and probably the easiest one to do, is one that runs across the form this way. And we already have a suggestion of its shape based on the curvature of either the top or the bottom ellipse. Choose one and stay consistent throughout. Do not change the curvature as you work your way down to reflect the perspective of the situation. That's going to create an inconsistent hatch. So I'm going to follow the form this way. This is essentially a horizontal hatch. This is a fairly large area to cover, so I'm going to break down the hatch marks into two layers, two patches. Keep those patches close together. This way they're going to blend organically into each other. But really the most important thing is to keep the distance between the hatching consistent throughout. This is something that I often mention in my cross-hatching tutorials. The consistency of gauge is really the most important thing, more important than getting the exact curvature right. Okay, now we're ready for our next angle, which is going to be a little bit steeper than the previous one. So perhaps running maybe 30 degrees this way. One important rule to keep in mind is that the curvature of the hatch, as it becomes more vertical, needs to become a little bit straighter. So if we run a line across our cylinder at a horizontal, and we tip it downwards like this, you can see that the curvature here follows the ellipse, either on top or the bottom, actually in this case halfway through. If we place an angle across a cylinder at a slightly more vertical angle, like so, you can see that the line becomes straighter. The steeper the angle, the straighter the line. So this line is almost straight until we get to an angle that is 90 degrees and it's perfectly straight up and down. So that's the main rule of hatching. When you change the angle, you're going to straighten the curve a little bit to reflect the reality of the surface. So the next layer might be like this. And again, it's going to be just a little bit straighter than the previous angle. Like so. Let's apply a third angle. This one not quite vertical, but maybe, I don't know, what would you call this? 80 degrees or so. This one's going to be straighter still. So here we're going to put a core shadow. That's a darker value that's in between the light break and the reflected light over here. That hatch mark is going to be fairly straight, almost straight. Again, notice that I'm trying my best to keep the gauge, the distance between the hatch marks, as consistent as possible. That's really the most important thing. Again, hatching is an illusion, where an artist places closely spaced lines and creates the impression of value. As soon as the gauge becomes inconsistent, it breaks the illusion. It makes value look like texture. Okay, so there is our next value, and now we can put down a vertical hatch that's perfectly straight. Maybe to reinforce the core shadow. By the way, if you're not familiar with that term, core shadow, reflected light, light break, I don't really have time to get into it here, but you can look at my introduction to cross-hatching tutorials that cover all of these things. So we're essentially working with 4 angles. We can apply more in different directions, but this is the general hatching strategy we're going to use on a cylinder. And once again, because folds are cylindrical in nature, we can use a similar strategy when shading our cylinders. Okay, so now let's apply the hatching strategies we used on the cylinder to our pipe fold. We're going to start by drawing the contours, and as I'm drawing contours, I'm following my rules of line. The most important is that when you're dealing with overlapping shapes, I'm not going to draw them with a single line. I'm going to try to emphasize overlap by making my lines fade in and fade out. So we have a line here that's going underneath this fold. That line needs to fade in. Here we have another fold that's disappearing behind this one. I'm keeping my contours a little bit open, emphasizing the overlapping nature of the folds I'm drawing. We have this fold going behind this fold. And then here, when you're drawing inside folds, use hatch marks to indicate softness, curvature, as opposed to strong single lines. So here I'm going to put down 2-3 lines, and then when it starts becoming contour, then I can use a single line. Just keep in mind that the edges of the curves here, the folds here, are farther away than the folds here. So you don't want to put strong lines here because that's also going to have a flattening effect. Always pay attention to where the forms are relative to the viewer when you're putting down your contours. Okay, and then for inside folds, I'm going to try to avoid being linear by putting down several lines, several hatch marks to indicate softness, curvature. Never use strong single lines when you're dealing with cylindrical curved objects. That's going to make them look two-dimensional. Okay, now I'm ready to render. So when rendering folds, I'm going to use the same strategies I used on the cylinder, since we're essentially dealing with cylindrical conical forms, but in reverse. So if you remember, with the cylinder, I started off with lines that run across at more or less a horizontal angle. In this case, we're going to start with a hatch mark that runs along the length of the folds, so essentially going downward in this case. So if we have a shadow on this fold, we're going to start off by filling the shadow with vertical hatch marks. This reinforces the sense of direction and is going to keep our drawing clearer and more organized. So as opposed to running across, we're going to start off with a downward hatch, or hatch following the direction of the folds. So in this case, we have a fold that's more or less running this way. We're going to follow the direction. So obviously, it's going to be difficult to fill this entire area all at once. So I'm putting down patches of hatching. The key is to keep those patches close together so that you don't have a gap. And you also want to avoid overlapping too much because that's going to create an uneven overlap here. However, this process is fairly forgiving. If you leave a little bit of a space between them, or you show a little bit of overlap, it's going to be okay. Right? This is not the only layer of hatching we're going to put down, and the next layer is going to make things look a little bit more even. Fact is, hatching might seem intimidating at first, but it's actually fairly forgiving. Really, a number of things have to go wrong in order for a drawing to be unsuccessful. So long as the majority of things you do in a drawing are correct, your drawing is going to be fine. And if you look at Durer's drawings, you really nitpick at them, look at the details, you'll see there's places where the hatching is a little bit uneven or even awkward. But there's very few places like that, obviously, right? Which makes the drawing really strong, really powerful. So don't obsess over little tiny details, the unevenness of hatching in places. As long as the overwhelming percentage of your drawing has good things in it, the drawing is going to be fine. Okay, so we have a little bit of a complicated area here. I'm going to see if I can capture. This entire area is in shadow, again, following the direction of the fold. We're going to fill in everything we see as shadow. So here the folds are kind of running down, but also running this way. So we're going to change the direction a little tiny bit here. So my advice is to block in your initial shadow areas with a hatch mark that follows the direction of the folds. Now that I have the general shadow areas inked with hatch marks that follow the direction of the folds, I can start putting down hatch marks at different angles. So I'm going to start off with something that is diagonal but fairly close to vertical to indicate darker values. And in this case, I'm paying attention to whether the folds are curving in or curving out. If they start curving in, I might start hatching at a slightly different direction. But for right now, I'm trying to keep it fairly simple and block in general values, general shadows. I'm not going into detail right now. I'm not doing a lot of carving. Again, work in patches if you can't fill in large areas. And hopefully you can see that as I put down hatch marks at different angles, because the patches don't line up, it creates a more even effect. So don't worry if one layer of hatching isn't perfectly even. The subsequent layers will make them look a little bit more even. Now the hatch marks here are a little bit shorter, they're a little bit smaller, and a little bit more responsive to the forms that I'm seeing. So if I'm seeing things curving different directions, feel free to change the shape of the curve. I think generally it's easier to hatch one angle at a time. So start off with one direction and then keep going more or less with the same direction all the way through, so you're working in layers. This will help keep the drawing a little bit more organized than working in small areas at a time. So one general direction. Again, that direction can change a little bit, but generally one direction at a time. So here the curves are curving out. Here they're starting to curve in a little bit. So in this case, I might do something like this, where they start curving out, and then I'm going to change the curvature to reflect the fact that this is going inward. Like so. Most important thing is, because we're dealing with rounded forms, you want to keep the transitions from shadows to lights soft, feathered. You don't want any sharp edges on rounded shapes, because that's going to make them look cuboid. like you're dealing with something that's sharp-edged, like a cube, as opposed to something that's rounded. You can see that even on a simple pipe fold like this, there's lots of complexity. So we have creases, we have areas of transparency, right? In this particular fold, we have light passing through and lighting up the shadow side of the fold. Right? The cloth is never easy, even in a simple pipe fold like this. Okay, so let's change the angle a little bit and start building up the contrast. So we're leading towards increasingly flatter angles, working across the form here. Okay, now I'm going to reinforce the shadow on this fold. When shading, always pay attention to what forms are closer to and what forms are farther away. So because this fold is the closest fold towards us, we want to introduce a little bit more contrast here than just about anywhere else. So this shadow running along the length of this fold, I'm going to make it a little bit darker to indicate the fact that it's closer to us. Again, following the principle of rendering cylinders, the more the hatch runs at a horizontal, the more it curves around the form. So these particular hatch marks are going to have the most curvature to them. Now, is it okay to go over an angle with the same angle? Yes, it is. It's going to make the drawing a little bit less clean, but if you want to go a little bit darker, you can always go back in with, let's say, a vertical angle. I recommend, however, that as much as possible, you try different angles. Don't go over the same angle twice. That's going to lead to a drawing that's less clean. Yes, it can be done. And part of it's a stylistic choice. If you want your cross-hatching to be super clean, every single angle needs to be a little bit different from the previous one. Hatching at the same angle several times creates a slightly messier effect. But depending on the style you're looking for, that could be favorable. That could be something you actually want out of your drawing. So far we've been hatching at this direction. We can start going a different direction. So we can start hatching at angles going this way. Try, and this is a basic rule of cross-hatching, not to put down more than, let's say, 5, 6 angles, if you can. Right? Any more is going to start making the drawing kind of confused, kind of messy looking. So something to be avoided. Try to conserve the number of layers you put down. Don't put down too many. And once you've got the general shadow areas down, you can start working a little bit more on the lighter side. So getting a little bit of that surface detail here that's going to make the cloth look a little bit softer. Right, so we're not dealing with rigid folds here. They're not perfect. There's areas where we have little creases running across. Make sure to introduce those, otherwise your cloth is going to look very, very stiff. So there is my pipefold demo. I'm going to call it complete. Though it's difficult to tell, this is probably how Durer drew his drapery. In this brilliant study, we see a lot of long hatching in the direction of the folds, with shorter, curved diagonal hatch marks reinforcing the cylindrical forms. Note that this is something he does not do when drawing the human form, where he rarely applies hatching in the direction of the form, and in the hatching on the hands, you can see him relying almost exclusively on short, cross-contouring strokes. Drawing drapery is excellent practice, but you must also practice drawing clothing that is influenced by the forms underneath it. To that end, a great way to practice is demonstrated in these studies of pillows by a very young Albrecht Durer. Drawing pillows is a great way to practice dealing with the complexities of stretched and pinched cloth, and are not only a highly effective training method, but also super fun to do. Copying sculpture is another fantastic stepping stone, since it eliminates the complexity of having to deal with cloth of different value. Look for sculptures by Michelangelo, Bernini, or Canova, sculptors that have a brilliant knack for creating convincing cloth out of stone, and avoid examples where the cloth is either left unfinished or is simply unconvincing. And lastly, copy old master examples, and lots of them. And do not limit your copying to drawings that are just done in pen and ink, since there's much to learn from paintings and drawings in any medium, so long as they're masterfully done. And while Durer is of course a fantastic resource, drawings by Michelangelo are also excellent, as are these drapery studies by his teacher, Ghirlandaio. In all of these cases, it's best to start simple, with details as opposed to tackling the entire thing. Practice by copying certain folds, or combinations of folds, and then, little by little, increase the difficulty. This progressive type of training, so common in other skill-based endeavors, such as music or sports, is for some reason given short shrift in artistic education, at least in the modern era. Gradually increasing the difficulty of your exercises is a great way to focus on separate skills, and the best way to avoid the frustration and disappointment that so often comes from trying to tackle problems that are beyond one's reach. The key is to make sure that the work is challenging and interesting enough, otherwise such exercises can become terribly boring and repetitive. Now let's put everything together and do a drawing of a clothed figure using this reference. Before I do, give me just a second to plug my long-form tutorials available for purchase on Vimeo. I have 2 classes available at the moment, with many more on the way. The first is called The Fundamentals of Crosshatching, the 6 Basic Strokes, which is an introduction to crosshatching for the beginning student. The second tutorial is called Drawing the Head in Pen and Ink, which, as the title suggests, deals with the complexities of drawing the head in this difficult medium. Your purchases help support my efforts here and are highly, highly appreciated. I'm starting my drawing with a graphite sketch, and going through the process of building the figure using simple forms, egg shapes, cylinders, and cones. For a demonstration of this process, please see my tutorial on how to sketch people, the link to which I'll post in the description section. This process allows me to determine the scale, proportion, and gesture of the figure without going into detail, and also helps me to understand what the forms are doing in space. Going back to that all-important principle that you have to understand what you're drawing in order to draw it well. Breaking down the forms in this way allows me to understand them 3-dimensionally, which will hopefully give my drawing a greater sense of solidity. Notice that I draw up a vertical line from the center of the neck down through the feet. This line in figure drawing is called the center of gravity and allows me to capture the balance of the figure. In this case, because the figure is placing her weight onto her right leg, her weight is shifted over it so that her head and the heel of her right foot are on the same vertical alignment. The center of gravity is essential to drawing this weight shift, which is called contrapposto. Once, and only once, I've finished the figure in this simple geometric way, do I proceed with dealing with the clothing. This is key. In order for the clothing to be drawn correctly, it must be placed on a correctly drawn figure, and that's very difficult to do if it's not dealt with beforehand. Take extra time to understand what's happening with the figure. It'll lead to better drawn clothing. When sketching clothing, start with simple shapes and think about what general volumes they fall into. Chances are they'll be either cylindrical or conical in nature, since clothing sits on the cylindrical or conical forms of the human body. Do not focus on the folds yet. Essentially, what we're doing here is mental sculpture. Imagine how a sculptor would go about creating this figure from clay. That sculptor would block in the simple shapes first and then proceed to the details. Same in drawing. Start with the simple shapes, seek to understand them three-dimensionally, and then go into detail. You'll get a more solid drawing for your efforts. How much detail you put into the sketch is up to you. Sometimes I put in the basic shapes and go right into inking. Sometimes I do a careful pencil underdrawing before I ink. The less underdrawing, the more spontaneous the ink lines will be, because they'll need to be drawn from direct observation. However, the trade-off for that spontaneity will be a lack of accuracy, since there will naturally be a greater tendency to make more mistakes. Far greater accuracy can be achieved with a careful pencil underdrawing, of course, but with a sacrifice of spontaneity, since there's a tendency to stop looking and responding to what you're seeing, and to simply trace over the pencil lines with ink. In this drawing, I took the middle route. I put in a lot of guiding detail, but still kept it simple, leaving a lot of detail lines that'll require keen observation. I find this middle route allows me some degree of spontaneity while still permitting me to be accurate. The next step is a useful exercise for the beginning artist, and not something I do in my own work at this point. I'm indicating the types of folds I'm seeing and their respective points of pressure and compression. This is not an easy task, since as mentioned, you can have several different kinds of folds in the same spot, and a number of different points of tension and compression, influenced not only by the forms underneath, but by the internal structure of the clothing. But taking the time to analyze what you're drawing is never a wasted effort, and you'll find that this slowing down now will result in a speeding up later as your skill improves. This is a key point. Many beginners think that the way to learn to draw fast is to practice fast drawing. What they don't realize is that the faster the artist works, the more they have to rely on memory and understanding. And the only way to build that memory and understanding is by working slowly, by analyzing forms, by memorizing patterns. Do not, therefore, be in a rush. Slow down and analyze, regardless of whether your plan is to be a patient renderer of polished academic studies or a speed demon of gesture drawing. For those of you interested in what pen and ink materials I'm using, I'm working with a Pilot Justice 95 fountain pen, the review for which you can find on my channel, filled with Noodler's black ink. The paper is nothing special, just a medium-tooth drawing paper made by Strathmore. You may notice that I'm somewhat unsystematic in the way I ink, working on both the contours and the inside folds all at the same time, as opposed to first carefully outlining everything. There's a method to the madness here, however. To my mind, this is actually a better way of doing things, because it lets you see more of the drawing earlier on and to make adjustments. One of the main things I'm looking for is for the elements that are closer to the viewer to be rendered with a little more sharpness than elements that are farther away. Working on both the inside and the outside of the figure helps me achieve that balance. And of course, as I work, I'm keeping those 5 rules in mind. Avoiding sharp lines when rendering folds, emphasizing points of tension and compression with sharper lines and shadow, redrawing certain folds to make them reinforce the cylindrical forms underneath, avoiding repetition in my folds, and lastly, fading lines in and out to emphasize overlap. Do I get things absolutely right all the time? Absolutely not. But again, pen and ink drawing is forgiving. So long as I get more things right than wrong, I can still pull off a successful drawing. And if things go completely haywire, I'll make note of my mistakes and correct them in a future drawing. Now on to the rendering. Now on to the shading. Keep in mind that we have large cylindrical shapes sitting underneath all of this busy surface detail. If we only shade the folds, but do not consider those larger shapes, our drawing will look like the figure underneath is flat as a wire hanger. It's useful, therefore, to first work on the larger forms first before dealing with the details. I do this by applying a curving diagonal hatch on the shadow side of those large cylinders, essentially shading the entire figure as if it was a simple cylinder. Be sure to make this general shading layer very fine in terms of line quality, since it's meant to sit rather quietly underneath, again, serving to reinforce the overall form. Then it's on to shading the individual folds. We start as we did with the simple pipe fold, by shading in the direction of the fold, except here it's a trickier task since we're dealing with so many different kinds of folds going in so many directions. This is where that initial diagramming of folds and tension and compression points is helpful. This way, even if you don't get the exact shape of the fold right, at least it'll be originating in the right place and headed in the right direction. Two things that make up a large part of what needs to be there to make that fold look convincing. Once you've shaded in the direction of the folds, start to put down shorter cross-contour folds at various angles. Remember to pay attention to whether the folds bulge out or cave in, and curve the hatch marks accordingly. Work only on one angle at a time, covering the entire drawing with hatching at that angle before moving to another angle. Think of the hatch angles as layers of wash, with each wash having a different angle as you go progressively darker. This will make your hatching more organized and the drawing cleaner. Again, is it okay to go over hatching with another layer at the same angle? Absolutely, go right ahead, but the drawing will be just a little messier for it. However, if you look closely at Durer's work, which contains some of the most breathtakingly dexterous hatching ever to be hatched, there are areas where he used the same hatching angle more than once. But this happens only in areas that need to go very dark, where the contrast is low, and the unevenness created by the hatching at the same angle is not quite as noticeable. By the way, I'll be doing a video where I copy Durer's famous praying hands very soon, so stay tuned. Here is my drawing. Yes, it's missing the textile pattern, but this video is already pretty long, so I'll leave the intricacies of rendering pattern, texture, reflective clothing, etc. for a future video, or perhaps even an online workshop, or both. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and if you did, please subscribe and stay tuned to more stuff like it. Thanks for watching, please consider purchasing my streaming classes, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.